My talk tonight's about the Confederate Violin Shotgun Case, one of the most interesting and mysterious objects in our collection. And I intend to use the violin case to show how material items like this can actually track cultural and historical changes. I'm going to show how people give symbols their meanings and how those meanings can change. In order to do so, I'm going to look first at the violin as an object of art, and then I'm going to focus on two of its elements in order to illustrate the process of change. The Confederate shotgun violin case is a very fine example of a particular type of art called an assemblage. It was invented by Picasso in 1912. The assemblage consists often, as here, of three-dimensional objects that are displayed against a flat plane. These objects can be shown as is or creatively transformed as here by the artist. The assemblage contains things that are found in everyday life, ordinary objects that can be industrially manufactured, domestic items, or even materials traditionally associated with the making of art. And our Confederate violin shotgun case contains examples of all of these. Assemblage was practiced by many, both in Europe and here in the United States, but perhaps one of the most interesting for our purposes is the American Louise Nevelson. Nevelson's assemblage became extremely popular in the 1950s and 60s and were noted for their jigsaw puzzle-like quality and for her habit of nesting various objects inside one another, which we can see here. Another very important feature of the assemblage is its wit, attention to wit. And we can see that here. Mr. Bryan often jokes that the Confederate violin shotgun case is a very early example of concealed carry. But the humor is also evident in the allusion to the classic gangster movies of Hollywood, in which shotguns were often concealed in violin cases. Practitioners of assemblage often paid extreme attention to the shock value of their creations. And we can see this here in the inscription that's painted on the back of the item and which is reproduced in full in your handout. The inscription was intended to, and does, provoke strong reactions in the viewer, either of solidarity or outrage. So that we can see that the Confederate violin shotgun case contains many elements of the classic assemblage. And next to the inscription is a small painted image of what we now know as the Confederate flag. And it's to this image that I'd now like to turn. And without discussing at all the flag's status as a flashpoint of division, and indeed without going into its history in detail, which is already the subject of a very thorough scholarly work by Gosky, I'm simply going to use the flag to illustrate the process of change. What we now know as the Confederate flag began life as the regimental symbol of a Civil War battalion commanded by General Robert E. Lee. As such, it was used to note the position of troops on the battlefield, to allow the officers to develop and implement strategy, but also as a focal point that enhanced the sense of camaraderie and shared purpose among the men. It was not even adopted as the official symbol of the South until well into the war, and even this was not without controversy, both as to the actual design of the flag, which went through several proposed versions before being finally adopted, but also as to its meaning. And of course, in this context, positioned next to the somewhat aggressive inscription, it's designed to emphasize that. But the Confederate flag was not always so used. It symbolized reconciliation and reunion when it was employed during the 1913 commemorations of the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And displayed in this context, it symbolized reconciliation, which was a major theme of those celebrations, and also perhaps recognition of the enormous suffering that was shared not only by both sides in the Civil War, but by everybody who was impacted by it. So that we can see, the flag was appropriated by the states of South Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia in the 50s and incorporated into their state flags. And this was done specifically in response to and resistance to the 1955 decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which federally mandated the integration of public schools. However, the flag was reappropriated by students in the South who used it with some alterations to symbolize their own support of desegregation and equal voting rights. So that we can see that the meaning of the symbol changes depending on the way that it's used. And the idea of appropriation and reappropriation becomes especially important in our consideration of Dixie, which is actually played by the violin in response to motion and is a part of our multimedia assemblage. The tune Dixie, even though it's considered to be the unofficial anthem of the South, actually achieved popularity on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line immediately after it was introduced. And it was heard in New Orleans and New York and appreciated all over. Abraham Lincoln used it as part of his campaign, on his campaign trail, and chose it to be played during his second inauguration in 1865. It was used and parodied by Union forces during the war, and the Union version of Dixie is also included in your handout, as well as the lyrics to the original version. But one of the most interesting aspects of Dixie is the history of its authorship. Although it's generally credited to Daniel Emmett, who was a musician and a minstrel player, recent scholarship suggests that Emmett actually learned it from neighbors of his in Mount Vernon, Ohio. Two brothers, the Snowdens, who were also musicians, but were the descendants of formerly enslaved people, and they were of African American ancestry. And it's said that the Snowdens learned Dixie from their mother, Ellen Cooper. Ellen Cooper was born into slavery in the South and may well have been the illegitimate daughter of a plantation owner. And it might have been for that reason that she was moved from the South to Mount Vernon, Ohio, with other members of the plantation owner's family. And this was clearly something that was not chosen by her. And Howard and Judith Sachs, who've written a book on the subject, suggest that the lyrics to Dixie really are nostalgic, not for the plantation, but for the sense of community and rootedness in African American plantation life that Ellen Cooper experienced in the South. And indeed, if you look at the lyrics to the tune, they contain a lot of domestic imagery, which supports the notion that it was written by a woman. And the Sachs also argue that it has some very specific geographical references that suggest it is referring to the specific place where Ellen Cooper grew up. And when we look at Dixie in this light, of course, its meaning changes completely. But the tune has been again reappropriated in our own time by Elvis Presley, for one thing, who included it as part of his American trilogy. The American trilogy starts with Dixie and continues with the Battle Hymn of the Republic and ends with a folk song, All My Trials, Lord. And I think that this combination of tunes presents the southern viewpoint, the northern viewpoint, but also the viewpoint of those who hoped for emancipation as a result of the Civil War. The tune was also recorded by a jazz singer, Renee Marie, also of African American ancestry, who also used it as part of a medley, this time with the Billie Holiday number, Strange Fruit. I'd like to play the Elvis and Renee Marie versions for you, but first, in conclusion, I'd like to offer my own interpretation of this object of art, which I think shows one of the side effects of the Civil War, which was the invasion of everyday life by violence. And that is shown in the combination, in the juxtaposition of objects. One aspect of the cleverness of this artifact is its musical theme, because just like a chord can only be understood by reference to the notes that surround it, the assemblage can only be understood by reference to the juxtaposition of objects within it and not by looking at any one element. So finally, I'd like to add that there remain many unanswered questions concerning the Confederate shotgun violin case, and to recommend that you do your own research and come up with your own conclusions as to what it means. Thanks.